dive into our third. What's your problem? It is. Thank you. Appreciate it. Um, so we're diving into our third message in this series from the book of Ruth, and we've just called this series of messages "When God Feels Far," and so we're going to finish up the message series next week, and just to kind of give you a heads up to let you to be able to prepare. Next week, after the end of our message, we're going to celebrate communion together. And so just want to give you that chance to prepare your heart and mind this week. And then next week together, we will celebrate the Lord's Supper. We will celebrate communion together. And so just want to kind of let you know that we're going to be doing that together next week. But my heart or my hope for you is that God would challenge your heart this morning and guide you into becoming a better follower as you leave today. Right? My prayer for us is that whenever we enter this space, that we would not just come simply into a service on any given week and leave without it affecting us. Like there's my prayer is that as you come in and as we worship God in giving, as we worship God in singing, that you're encouraged by each other, that we lift each other's prayer requests up, and as we open the Word of God, that you would leave this space different than when you came in. And so this morning, I just kind of want to start with a question. How many of you have ever read, and I guess we could say at this point too, seen one of the movies from the Chronicles of Narnia? How many of you either read those books or saw any of the movies, right? And those books were written by a guy named C.S. Lewis, right? And he wrote a couple of other books, Mere Christianity. You've probably heard me quote from C.S. Lewis before, but he finished writing the Chronicles of Narnia around 1956, 57, right? And he lived in England. And I remember first encountering the Chronicles of Narnia, right? Fourth, fifth grade. I had wandered into the church library. My family didn't have a television growing up, and so I read a lot. I mean, I would go into a library, especially during the summer. They would have the summer reading program, and I would take a stack of books like this. And I didn't read, third, fourth grade. I wasn't reading, little kids' books. I was already reading novels, And so I'd come up to the stand with, a stack of books like this. And I remember one time going up and lady looks at me and she says, you only get these books for a month. And I looked at her and I said, lady, this is only going to last me a week. And she kind of looked at me like, and my mom was standing behind me going, he'll probably finish them before we come back next week. And so I had wandered into the church library, because it was another source of books for me, and encountered these books. And the first one that drew my attention was A Horse and His Boy, right? And that was the first one of the books that I read, and it eventually read them all, but the Chronicles of Narnia, just an incredible story, and all my kids have kind of read those books or seen the videos now as well. And there was another one of C.S. Lewis's books that I have since read, and it's called A Grief Observed. A Grief Observed. And in that book, C.S. Lewis says this. He says, meanwhile, where is God? Go to him when your need is desperate, when all other hope is vain. And what do you find? You find a door slammed in your face and the sound of bolting and double bolting from inside. After that silence, and after that, you might as well turn away. And the question, you read that, you hear that quote from this book, A Grief Observed, and you're like, does it seem to you that he's having a bad day? Right? He says, you go to God when your heart is full of joy, right? And it is good. And he says, but you try to go to God when you're in need, or when your hope is desperate, when your heart is desperate. And what do you find? He says, it seems like the door is slammed in your face, and then God locks it. And right, you've all seen the scene from the movie where there's the person who's locking like 75 locks on a door, right? And that's what C.S. Lewis says he feels like it is when you've gone to God, and the door is shut and the door is locked. How long do you stand there wondering where is God? And you read something like that, and the question that comes into my mind is like, what happened to that guy? That's where you encountered God and you felt that feeling. So what happened to him? Well, what happened to him is he was a bachelor for most of his life, and he gets married in his later years, and his wife dies of cancer, and he's inconsolable. Right? He starts corresponding with this woman named Joy, and she lives in America. And her husband had left her and her two sons, and she moved to England. And C.S. Lewis and her are close friends. And it seems that he married her originally not out of romance, but out of a visa issue, right? It's a civic wedding so that she could remain in England. But then as time and their friendship, it grows into a romance. And then she contracted cancer. And he marries her a second time in a Christian wedding beside her hospital bed where it is assumed she's going to die. And then the cancer goes into remission right around 1957 as he's finishing the stories, the Chronicles of Narnia. And so him and Joy, they travel together. They're kind of doing life together. The cancer was in remission, and then just a few short years later, 1960 or so, the cancer comes back and she dies, and he is just inconsolable. And it wasn't one of those times when God felt near and dear as a comforter for C.S. Lewis. It was a point in his life when God felt far away. And we've quoted from, the Psalms, right? You dig into any number of the Psalms. Psalms 10, it says, why, God, do you stand so far off? But why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? And in the Psalms, you have King David going through some desperate difficulty. And it doesn't seem like God was close. It seems like God was far. And as we open our Bibles today to the book of Ruth, when we encounter Naomi in our story, she doesn't feel the nearness of God. It feels like God is far. To her, it feels like God is against her. You see, Naomi and her husband, we've talked about this. They had moved out of the land of Israel because of the famine. They had moved several hundred miles to the land of Moab, and Elimelech and her boys they leave the land of Israel. They go to Moab to escape the famine and to weather through in this foreign land. And then the plan, I imagine, was to come back. And we read in the first chapters, the first verses of the book of Ruth, and it tells us the husband dies. It doesn't tell us how. It doesn't tell us, any of the just he's dead. But at least the boys are left and they can marry. And so there's some hope for a future. But then we read the boys die as well. And you're left with these three widow women. And it's like if the book of Ruth was a play, at this point, all of the male characters have moved off of the stage, right? Exit stage right. And the grief that Naomi is traveling through, the loss of her husband, the loss of her boys. I mean, just imagine it had to have been suffocating and debilitating. And just from our perspective, we think, man, how awful to lose your husband and your boys. In their culture, it was really even worse because having a son is how the family name passes on. It's how the inheritance was passed on. To have children, that's your social security. I mean, that is your retirement. And if all the sons have died, it's like your family never existed. I mean, this 80-year-old woman, right? And she says to me, I'm the last one left. All of her family has died. She didn't have any children. And so when she dies, her family will no longer carry on. And it's like her family will be forgotten. And so just like Naomi, she's facing this. I'm the last of my family. When I die, it will be like we never existed. And so as you open the pages of Ruth, you also have that spinning in this desperate tragedy that's happened in the life of Naomi. And Naomi, she gets back to Bethlehem from Moab. And they're like, Naomi, she's back. And Naomi's like, no, don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, because God has made my life bitter. I left full, and God brought me back empty. God is against me. And kind of that quote that we read from C.S. Lewis's book, and how many are at the end stage of life, and those of us that are lost in deep grief. And Leslie, she runs our grief share ministry out of the church here, and there's some flyers in the back. If you or somebody that is traveling through a season of grief, we want to help you walk through that season. And so if you or somebody is in that space where you would be well served, traveling through and working through grief, reach out to Leslie. I'm sure she will be able to help you, get you plugged into that. But if you are in the season of deep grief, or deep depression, often the question is, meanwhile, where is God? And I think Naomi is really asking that same question. Meanwhile, where is God? And kind of the driving question in the book of Ruth, the kind of undercurrent that we see is, has God's faithfulness run out for this woman? Has God's faithfulness run out for this family? Right? Has God's goodness run out for this woman and her family? And it's a good question. It's a good conversation for us to have, because there could be a time in your life where maybe you're asking the question, has God's faithfulness run out for me? Has God's goodness run out for me? And so spending these Sundays studying, digging into the book of Ruth together, it gives us the opportunity to talk about this issue of loss. And if you have not experienced loss in your life, you're very old, because it's something that affects us all. And to talk about losing things, and to talk about how God's goodness may present itself when we lose things. Because in a fallen world, in a broken world, we will lose things. And again, I'm not just talking about your car keys, right? Sometimes we lose our reputation. Sometimes we lose our credit. Sometimes we lose our house. We lose our home, right? Guy comes home and says, I have good news and I have bad news. Good news, first, I have been promoted. Hooray. Bigger salary, new position. Okay, what's the bad news? The bad news, we have to move, right? If I stay here, no longer any job. If we move, I get a better job. And it's kind of like the kids, they go to school. I mean, literally, they can walk there. It's just down the street. And, here's the challenge now. Do we stay here and keep our home, and not just our home, our house, but, the school, the doctor, the church, the friends, but we're unemployed? Or do we move to no church, no school, no friends, to a job, and even in that, it's like there's this sense of loss. I know people that have lost their careers, right? 25 years at the same company, and then the company gets bought out, change in leadership, and even you think in Greenville 25 years ago in this area there were jobs, and this area has lost thousands of jobs over the years. And so there's the possibility of saying, I have to find a new line of work because those kind of jobs are gone. You can lose people, right? You can lose a boyfriend or a girlfriend to a breakup, husband or a wife to a divorce or death. You lose a brother or sister, parent. You can lose a child whose heart turns from God. See, these are losses that in the human experience, we can experience any number of them. And so as we enter the story today, and we check in on Naomi, and we check in on Ruth, and Naomi's kind of at this point where she was like, I feel like God is against me. I feel like God is far. And it's like all of these losses she's experienced are compounded. And again, that can be very real for us as well, where we go through a season of significant loss. and we don't feel the nearness of God. You come and you sit in a church service, or you turn on a podcast or a YouTube video, and it's like you hear about the nearness of God. You hear other people talking about the nearness of God, and you're just like, I just don't feel it. I don't sense the nearness of God right now. And you like write Psalms 10, God, why do you stand so far off? Like, God, why are you playing hide and seek when I need you? And if you go through a season of loss or grief or depression, and you feel like God is not close, but he is far, it seems like it compounds your grief. And so this driving question that we have behind our series and in this story is God's faithfulness. Has God's goodness run out for this woman? Can God's goodness, his faithfulness, run out for you? And it's like you dive into this book. We started a new series with our youth on Wednesday, and we're looking at the truth of Scripture. Does Jesus exist? And we're doing kind of the Truth Project on Sunday nights, but we're taking a little different tact with the youth on Wednesday. But we're looking at it from the viewpoint of a crime scene, like a person of interest, a nobody, cold case. Can we prove the existence of God? And in a crime scene, it's like you come and you dust for prints, you look for evidence that something had happened, and what does it point to? And as we approach the book of Ruth, as we read through chapter 1 and chapter 2 and chapter 3, what I think we're looking for, it's like we're dusting for God's fingerprints in this story. And if you're looking, you see God's fingerprint of his goodness all throughout the story. But here's the deal. They don't look like God's fingerprints, right? They look like Ruth's fingerprints, because when Naomi moves back, Ruth, the daughter-in-law, says, no, I'm going to go with you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And she says, I'm leaving my family. I'm leaving my homeland, my country, and I'm going with you, and going to people in a place I've never seen, and I'm going to care for you. And it's like the goodness of God shows up in Naomi's life, but it shows up in the goodness of Ruth to her mother-in-law. The faithfulness of God shows up in the faithfulness of Ruth. And so as you're examining the story of Ruth for the fingerprints of God, you will find them, but they look like Ruth's fingerprints. And then there's that guy we encountered last week, right? The guy by the name of Boaz. And Ruth woke up one morning and it's kind of like, hey, we need to eat. And how about I try to go get some of the grain that's left, this process called gleaning, where she could walk through after the harvesters. And mother-in-law says, okay, just be careful. And she goes, if I can find a farm, a field where the owner won't run me off, and she starts to glean, and the owner shows up, and his name is Boaz. And like Boaz shows up, and what is Ruth? I mean, like, she probably got a little nervous. Is this guy gonna run me off now? And Boaz shows up and he's kind of says to the foreman, who is that woman? I don't recognize her. I've never seen her before. And Foreman's like, oh, that's the Moabite that came back with Naomi. And so Boaz calls her over. And I imagine that, whatever, that walk, what's going on in her? Like, is he gonna, like, what? But Boaz calls her over and he offers her protection. He tells his guys, don't touch the girl. He offers her water and food to eat at lunch. He's talking to her. He's like, my daughter, my daughter. It's like he offers this care and compassion. And he says to her, don't go to any other field. Just come work in my fields, because you go to another field, someone might harm you or take advantage of you. So every day you head out here, look for my crew. Look for my servant girls, follow them. And last week we saw Ruth comes home that first night with a pile of grain. I mean, just unheard of. Like, that never happens. And meanwhile, the question, where is God? Is he faithful? Is he good? And his fingerprints are all over. But they don't look like God's fingerprints. They look like Boaz's fingerprints. And we see the goodness of God shows up in Boaz. The faithfulness of God shows up in the faithfulness of Boaz. And today, as we turn the page again, as we open the story again, you need to know something. This is Naomi's grief share. Naomi is healing. Now, I don't think her grief is totally past, but there's this beautiful thing that I see happening, and it's like, whoa, Naomi, I think, has turned the corner. Naomi, who lost her husband 10 years ago, and she lost her boys, and she is healing now. And as we open chapter 3, some of these verses, as we read them together, chapter 3, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, she said to her, my daughter, shouldn't I find security for you so that you will be taken care of? It's like you open chapter 3 and Naomi says, honey, we need to find you a husband, right? I need to find you a husband. Shouldn't I find you a home where you will be, what does it say? Taken care of. Naomi's healing here, I think. And I think she's healing because she's now able to envision a hopeful future. She is able to look past her present pain and grief. She's able to look past the mess that she's been through, and she's able to say to Ruth, we need to find you a husband. And I think we know that she is healing because she's able to envision a hopeful future. And sometimes in life, it is possible for you to get slammed with something. And you get that phone call on a random Tuesday that changes everything. And when that happens, it is entirely possible that the only thing that you can see is your grief or your pain, the abandonment, the betrayal, the desertion. And all we can see is just our vast disappointment. It's like all we can look at. And I think we just need to know that at this point in chapter 3, I think Naomi has broken through that stuff. Because with whatever grief she's still experiencing, she's at this point able to say, okay, we're moving on. We need to get you married. And I think those are moving onwards. Those are those are the kind of things that we can know when we are experiencing a season of grief, when we can reach that point where we can envision a life ahead, but when we can begin to move past the grief, because there's that ability to look past the current pain and the current suffering and the disappointment. There comes a day when we need to move through our grief, at least to the point where we can go, okay, I'm moving on now. Now, again, take time to grieve your losses, right? Take time. When I worked in hospice care and worked with families that were losing their loved ones, one of the things that I often would talk through people with and work with them is taking time to grieve, to grieve the loss. But again, loss is not just the death of a spouse or a child or a parent. Grieve the loss of the fiance that failed on you. Grieve the job that you lost, the house and your credit. You can take time to grieve that. You must grieve. I don't worry uh, about the people who grieve. The people I worry about are the people who kind of get stuck. They never get past it, right? And I know we all take different time, to grieve, but there should be a point where you say, okay, I'm moving on. I'm moving forward. And again, how long that takes is different for all of us, right? Disappointment comes at us with different weight and different impact and different speeds. One of the things that's very disruptive in a marriage where a child dies, right, is that the parents may grieve at different speeds. Death, right, it can separate the grievers from each other because we grieve in different ways and at different speeds. And I mean, how many times I saw this and working in hospice where, you got one person on kind of one side that's just like, let's just move on. And the other person says, obviously, you did not love them the way I did. Siblings who lose a parent, and 3 years later, one is still incapacitated, and the other says, like, move on already. But understand, we grieve at different speeds. And so I don't know what speed you need to grieve. I do know that there is a day out there when your grief needs to dissipate enough to say, I did not die. I have a life that God intends for me to live. And so I am moving on. And may God give you the grace to say someday, today's the day I'm moving on. Now, you will always miss them. You may still even cry at times. You may be ambushed by sadness, but you have a life to live. And there will come a day, a season when you say, okay, I need to move on. And so I don't worry about people who are experiencing grief as much as I worry about the person who doesn't grieve at all. Like who moves on without grieving, just kind of bottles it and buries it away. I also feel for those people who get stuck, just paralyzed. It's like time stops. And it doesn't matter how many months, how many years, and they are just forever stuck at that moment. But here, as we read in the book of Ruth, I think we see Naomi is moving on. I think she's healing because she wakes up one day and she's like, okay, we're in a mess, but we are moving forward. And I'm going to find you a husband. She has a purpose. One of the things that can happen in grief is we can lose our purpose. We can get so blindsided by the grief or the depression that we feel we have no purpose. And Naomi, she's healing, and she's healing because she's able to envision a hopeful future, and she now has this purpose. She's able to focus on something other than Naomi. And Naomi says to Ruth, I should find for you a home where you will be provided for. And Naomi is thinking not about Naomi here. Naomi is thinking about Ruth. And that's huge, right? There's that vortex of depression and grief and loss. And it's like, I heard this one guy say one time, he was traveling through the season of depression. He's like, I'm like Pete FM, right? You know, the radio station, they're like, it's all country all the time, right? He's like, I'm like Pete FM. It's all Pete all the time, and you just get sucked in to this. It's all you all the time, my grief, my pain, and it's just, we become very myopic. And you just need to know here, Naomi's broken free from this. It's not about me. I'm sure she's still grieving, but enough of the fog has dissipated for her to focus on something other than Naomi. And that's powerful. And I just want to challenge you, if you like experience depression, blues, sadness, if you're ever in that space of depression where you be by yourself, understand that's when you need people the most, right? To awaken and look for a way to say, you know what, today's not going to be about me. Today I'm going to find something other than me to focus on. It's not just my problems, not just my workload, not my, just like, today will not be about me. And those are powerful words that sometimes we need to say to ourselves. And I think here that's what Naomi has done. And she has turned a corner. And she wakes up, a woman who has lost her husband and lost her children. And she says, today will be about Ruth. The Apostle Paul, he writes to the Philippian people, and he says this. He says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, rather in humility value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interest, but looking, each of you, to the interest of each other. Value others as more important than yourselves. And I think that's what Naomi is doing here. She's traveled through grief, and yet she's valuing Ruth's needs above her own. And the fingerprints of God are all over the story. And today they look like Naomi's fingerprints. Because you should not only look out for your own interest, but the interest of others. I mean, you and I know this. Your capacity, my capacity to be self-absorbed knows no bounds. Right? Understand, when you walk in a room and you're like, man, everybody's looking at me, everybody's thinking about me. No, they're not. They're thinking about themselves. Just like you walked into the room thinking everybody's looking and thinking about you. When you walk into a room, understand most people are not thinking about you, they're thinking about them. Because our ability to be self-absorbed and self-focused knows no bounds. But to step beyond that and say, you know what, today will not be about me. Today will be about somebody else. And so the question is, hey, Naomi, any suggestions? Who's the potential husband? And oh, yes, she has had someone come to mind in verse 2. Now, isn't Boaz our relative? Okay, haven't you been working with his female servants? This evening he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Boaz, who is allowing you to glean from his field. Boaz, who has said, don't touch her, giving protection already. Boaz, who says, drink from the water jars. He is already bringing protection to you in the field and provision from his field. Maybe he would like to make this minor step and make it year round. Is not Boaz looking out for you? Maybe he, is a potential husband. And some of you are like, yeah, we saw that coming, right? I knew she's in the field. He's in the field. They see each other day after day. And there's just this, that moment when their eyes lock and they realize this is more than just a friendship, right? And he discovers I loved her from the moment I saw her. That's not what's happening here. Okay. I think when Naomi brings this up, hey, Boaz, he's a relative of ours. I don't think it's occurred to Ruth that this is a potential husband, right? When this is presented to Boaz, I don't think it's occurred to Boaz that Ruth is a potential bride. I think we kind of see that by the way he keeps calling her daughter, right? Daughter, stay in my fields. My guys won't bother you. Daughter, come drink from our jugs together. I think this kind of indicates that she is younger than him, that there's maybe a little age gap here. And I know I'm probably going to destroy this story for you, but Boaz most likely already has a family. Okay. In Old Testament times, having more than one wife was not entirely uncommon. Okay. Now, it doesn't say that Boaz already had a wife, but just understand it's inconceivable in that culture that he would have any kind of prominence in society, because remember how important sons were, how important having children was. It's just really inconceivable that in this culture he had never been married. Now, maybe he's a widower, but priority number one is have a son who can be attached to the property, because you will be remembered and keep your family alive through son and property. And so it's just inconceivable that this guy just moves 30, 40, maybe 50 years and has never had any time to get married. It really would have been culturally unacceptable. And so just understand it's possible he already had a family and a wife. Now, I don't recommend this to you, though Boaz may have gotten away with it. I don't think you will. And I'm not advising this. I'm just describing this, okay? It is possible that this guy is not just like, uh, about to go on the Most Eligible Bachelor show, okay? It's possible he's already married and has a family. Again, why he wouldn't be looking at Ruth as a potential wife. And basically what Naomi says is perhaps he would allow you into his household. Perhaps in addition to protection and provision, it is possible he may have you come into his family full time. And then Naomi begins to plot and scheme, right? I think Boaz has only seen Ruth when she is in the field, dirty, dusty, grimy, perspicuous, right? And Naomi's like, honey, take a bath. right? Put on some perfume so you don't look like just a farmhand, but like someone that could be a potential wife, and then go to the threshing floor. And where the guys are camped out, you will see the place where he's sleeping for the night. I will tell you what to do, and then you listen and do what he tells you to do. And so, a threshing floor, 1,000 years before the time of Jesus, it would have been like a big kind of usually a circle space, rather large, 25, 50 foot across. And they would bring all uh, the grain that had been harvested there, and they would put it down. And then we all know what a toboggan is, right? Here in Michigan, we know what a toboggan is. It's not something you put on your head, right? Down south, they call a toboggan a cap or a hat, or like a right winter stocking hat. They call it a toboggan. But we all know what a toboggan is, right? It's like a sled, right? Well, that's what they would use. They would use like these toboggans. They hook them up behind a cow or a donkey, and put some weight on it, usually a person, and they would sit on that, and you would pull that sled around on this threshing floor, and it begins to separate the grain from the stalks. And once you've done that long enough, and you separate uh, the grain in the threshing, then the next process is you kind of get now got this heap of seed. Then you do the process of winnowing, and what you do in winnowing is it's kind of been all ground up. Now you take a pitchfork or like this, like kind of like a fork, and you grab it and you throw it up in the air, because the seed, what you want, is heavier than the chaff, and the wind kind of blows the chaff away. So very dusty, kind of dirty process. But you'll see that they're tossing it up, and in many places in the world they still do the process this way, right? And toss the grain up into the air, the chaff rolls away. It's a long process. It takes hours and days, depending on how much grain you have to do. But this is what you have to do in order to secure the profit from the field in the form of usable grain. And so these guys we've walked through the harvesting. We're into the process of threshing and winnowing. And they would do this all day until, it's like you come to work, do this, and then go home to bed at night and then come back. No, you sleep by the pile of grain, because again, that's your food for the year. That's your profit for the year. And you do not want somebody to sneak in the middle of the night and haul off that pile of grain that you have worked so hard for. And so you sleep right there by the pile of grain until you're able to take it to your storage, silos, or where you're storing it. But you camp right out there. And so Naomi says, watch where Boaz is at. And when he lays down, and once he's asleep, go uncover his feet and lay down at his feet. And that's where you pick up the story in verse 8. It's like at midnight, Boaz was startled, turns over, and laying at his feet was a woman. It's dark. And so he asked, "Who are you?" "I am Ruth, your slave," she replied. "Spread your cloak over me, for you are a family redeemer." Or it may say kinsman redeemer. This is key. A kinsman, right, is a family member. A redeemer is someone who buys back. And so we just have like this plot twist that is thrown into the story here. The drama gets added, because he doesn't simply say, get down on one knee and say, "Hey, Boaz, I'd like to be your wife. Will you marry me?" She is asking him to do something far beyond that. She says, "Spread the corner of your cloak over me." The idea here is the imagery of coming under the protection and care of this man. Like, will you take me in? And she is basically proposing, will you marry me? Will you bring me into your provision and protection? But then she adds that bit about you are a kinsman redeemer. What she is asking him is to go beyond and above what is involved in simply being a husband. And Boaz is going to respond. He's going to be like, "Yeah, baby. All right. You be looking good." Verse 10, he says, "No." Then he said, "May the Lord bless you, my daughter." Right? "You have shown more kindness now than before." Again, I think he's talking about the kindness that she has shown to mother in law Naomi. And he goes on, "Because you have not pursued younger men, whether rich or poor." Again, an indicator, I think, that Boaz is an older guy. Verse 11, "Now don't be afraid, my daughter. I will do for you whatever you say, since all the people in my town know you are a woman of noble character." Which isn't exactly kind of the romantic words that a bride would want to be told, right? As a prospective bride, "Will you marry me? I've heard you have a noble character," right? It's kind of like I would want there maybe to be a little something more than that, but not here. He will learn to love her. He will grow to love her. Emotion will follow devotion, right? Okay. Again, I don't believe that this storyline is romantically driven, right? I think he will learn and grow to love her. He will learn to love her, but he will act now and feel later. In verse 12, he says, "Yes, it is true that I am a kinsman redeemer, a family redeemer, but there is a redeemer closer than I am. I would like to marry you, but I can't. Someone has this privilege first. We got to run it by him." Verse 13, "Stay here tonight and in the morning. If he wants to redeem you, that's good. Let him redeem you. But if he doesn't want to redeem you, as the Lord lives, I will. Now lie down until morning." I mean, also something a woman doesn't want to hear while being proposed to, right? If Jim wants to marry you, awesome, go for it. But if he passes, I'll be next in line, right? Again, this is not like our modern romantic, Naomi sends Ruth out to seduce Boaz. That's not what's happening here. And when Boaz says, "Stay here till morning," again, it's dark. It's a long way back to town. There are bad people and dangerous animals out there. Yeah, I think he's still concerned about her safety and says, "Stay here till morning," right? It's kind of like his first words to her are, "I told my guys not to touch you. I told them not to harm you." Again, he, as a good man, is concerned about this woman's well-being. And he goes on, right? He went on there. He's like, again, there is a nearer relative that has this right before me to redeem. And the question isn't this like about marriage? Yes, and something else, right? Because there's all this cultural stuff spinning here that kind of we don't even think about and often don't know about. And we open a Bible story like the book of Ruth and we start reading it and we read it from 2024 West Michigan eyes and experience and knowledge, and we're kind of like, okay. And that's why I always say that when you open the Word of God, you've got to understand what did it mean to them, so then we can apply what does it mean to us. We gotta understand what was spinning in their culture, in their world, so that we can know. And so they get up in the morning. Boaz gives her a bunch of grain, and he says, don't go back empty-handed. And she goes back to Naomi. Boaz takes off, and he goes and sits in the town gate, right? A large city would have a number of gates, but a village would have just kind of like one way in, one way out, one gate. And the villages would have been walled for basic protection, right? And so you shut the gate, you have a little protection. And so if you went and sat in the town gate, again, there's only one way in, one way out, and you want to find someone to have a conversation, like they're probably going to go in or out of that gate at some point during the day, right? So you go sit there long enough, and so that's what Boaz does. It's also where like business was transacted. Any legal transaction takes place. In Uganda, with our RPI stuff, when we go to purchase land, it's not just like hey, how much do you want for the land? $5,000. Okay, here's $5,000. No, it's a process. Like to purchase the land that we just got, like you had to bring in the village elders, you had to bring in all the family. I mean, like it's like 30 people that sit down in order to purchase land. So understand in kind of that culture, business is transacted in front of the village elders, in front of witnesses that can all say, yes, that transaction happened. And so here comes the guy who's the closer kinsman redeemer. And Boaz kind of calls him over and kind of sit down. And there's the elders that come over to witness. And he says to the closer family member, Naomi is back from Moab, and she is selling a piece of land that belonged to Elimelech. And I thought that I should bring this to your attention in front of the elders and suggest that you buy it in front of the elders. If you will redeem it, let me know. If not, then I will do it because you're first in line than me. Naomi is selling her dead husband's property. Do you want to buy it? And guys like, yeah, I'd love to expand and grow my holdings, right? So what's going on here? One of the gaps that we have to, make through here is that, again, we're going to sell the property. Mom and dad pass away. Their property's for sale. We sell it, right? Just common. But in this village, the family farm, a name gets attached to the place, right? It's the Patterson's place or the Jones farm. The land takes on the family name. And so here, what's happening is guy dies, leaves his kids. The kids cannot manage the farm. Somebody steps in and raises up until the boys are old enough, and then the farm, goes back to them. And so what happens here is Boaz approaches this guy and says, "Do you want the property?" And guy says, "Yeah," but he uses the word redeem it. I'll redeem it. And Boaz says, "Oh yeah, by the way, when you get the property, you also get a wife." Verse 5. Then Boaz says, "On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you will also acquire Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the deceased man, to perpetuate the man's name on his property." And at this, the guy's like, "I'm out." Right? Because it might do danger to my estate, to my holdings, right? So understand what's happening. I buy the property, I marry Ruth. If we have a kid, I raise the boy, and when he becomes of age, he gets all of this land, this property. And it's kind of like he's my kid, but he gets the dead guy's name, the family. It's like he's like a surrogate son. And so again, whatever the price is in getting this property up and running and maintaining it, and you manage it for 18 or 20 years. And basically what this closer kinsman redeemer says is, I'm not willing to jeopardize my estate, my holdings, that 20 years invested into a property that I'm just going to give away. And so Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses today that I am buying from Naomi everything that belonged to Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. Verse 10, I will also acquire Ruth the Moabitess, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, to perpetuate the deceased man's name on his property, so that his name will not disappear among his relatives or from the gate of his home. You are witnesses today. And so what happens when on the threshing floor where Ruth says, cover me with your cloak, and introducing this kinsman redeemer part of it, is she's inviting Boaz into a rescue mission. She is inviting Boaz to partner with her in rescuing something. They are attempting to rescue her dead husband's family tree. If Boaz and Ruth have a child, it will be in the lineage of Boaz and Ruth, but it will also be in the lineage of Elimelech. And I like that about this story, because what I like about this story is everybody is looking out for everybody else, right? I like when that Ruth says, I'm going to leave everything behind to care for you. And now we see Naomi caring for Ruth by saying, we've got to find you a husband, even though it could cost her personally. And then there's Boaz, who just like is selflessly giving. And like this marriage isn't just about getting a wife, but about providing for the family tree of Elimelech. And he will buy this property at personal cost, and they will attempt to have a child. And when that child comes of age, he will keep his family name and the family land. And so it's just Ruth is looking out for Naomi. Ruth is looking out for Naomi. Ruthie is looking out for Ruth. And Boaz is looking out for Elimelech. And Elimelech isn't even alive anymore. It's like everyone is looking out for everyone else. And it's just a beautiful thing. And you run into those situations where everyone's looking out for themselves, and man, it gets ugly fast. And it's just a beautiful picture here where people are looking out for each other, where a family is looking out for each other, where neighbors are looking out for each other, where church members are looking out for each other. And you run into this book of Ruth where all the characters are just looking out for each other. And you know, and maybe you're sitting in this room and you're like, man, I've never had anyone looking out for me. I mean, my dad bailed on me, my mom bailed on. I mean, like, I pretty much raised myself. You know, somebody bailed on you. And just understand, when you hear me say things like, I hope that you would come to know the love of Jesus, what I'm saying to you is that there is someone who entered this planet and sacrificed more than money to buy your soul back. And just like Ruth, who was incapable of resolving the situation on her own, you enter this life incapable of self-rescue, incapable of self-redemption. And there's this day when Jesus is walking with his disciples, and his disciples are in this argument over like who's going to be the greatest, right? Who, you're supposed to serve me, and no, you're going to serve me. And Jesus, he turns to them and he calls himself the Son of Man. And he says, for the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. See, Jesus says, I came to be the Redeemer, as the buyer to pay something that you could not. Sacrificed myself for you. And so it's not any stretch of the imagination for people to look at Boaz, who stepped up and stepped in to pay money he did not owe in this rescue situation. It's not any stretch to see Boaz just as a picture of what Jesus Christ would come and do and act as our Redeemer. Because that term we use for what he did at the cross is redemption. And just let that sink in. As you come into Gowen Bible Church, and we are learning the Bible, and I hope that we are always doing it in a way that is real and relevant and true. And you know what? This book that is very old is still very relevant to my life experience. I mean, it will help me in my life. My fear is for those people that walk into a church and Jesus is not in them. And the crucified and resurrected Jesus sends his spirit to live in us. But understand, he needs to be invited in. And if you're in a church for any length of time and you never hear or are given the opportunity to make that decision to say, Jesus, I need you as my Redeemer. I need you to be my personal Savior. Like, understand, those words are not meaningless. Understand, you are incapable of self-rescue, of self-redemption. You and I need a Redeemer to step in. And just understand, when we call on his name, see, Jesus came for the world, but he came for you. He came for me. And just, if you've never done that, I want to welcome you to invite Jesus in this morning, because God just dumps his love. And when he dumps his love into you and I, he does so that it may spill out into the lives of others. And that's what we see happening in the book of Ruth. That God's goodness and his faithfulness is flowing out of the lives of people into other people's lives. The power of Jesus comes to infect your life and to fill you every day, so that you would regularly wake in and say, today is not about me. Today is about what the indwelling power of Jesus in me wants to do through me. And my hope is that when we walk in here any given Sunday, that may be the Sunday that you look back 5 years from now and say, it was that Sunday that everything changed. It was that Sunday that I began my spiritual journey, or it was that day that I renewed my spiritual fervor to do what God has called me to do. And so this morning, as we close, I just want to invite you to invite Jesus. Take a few moments today to invite Jesus in wherever you are. Invite him in so that others can see his goodness and grace and mercy in you and through you. Father, we come before you. God, you are good and you are faithful, and you desire to show your goodness to the world through us. God, empower us and strengthen us to do just that, so that the world will know that we have a good Father. We thank you. We worship you. It's in your Son's name that we pray. Amen. We'll have our worship team come up and